The hall was already at its edge when Era walked in. 340 alien delegates sat packed into a room that smelled like every atmosphere at once, and not one of them was making a sound. That was the first wrong thing. Diplomatic summits were never quiet. They were full of clicking and hissing and the low harmonic rumble that the Vreth used as casual conversation. But the moment Era pushed open the wide glass door and stepped inside, everything went still. She did not notice. She was looking at her datapad, scrolling through a briefing on trade corridor disputes in Sector Vale 9, and she nearly walked into a call delegate before she looked up, smiled quickly, said "excuse me," and stepped around it. The call delegate did not move for 11 seconds after she passed. Era found the back row, which was the only row with empty seats, and she sat down. She unzipped her bag, pulled out a metal thermos, unscrewed the lid, and poured herself coffee. The smell drifted through the recycled air of the station. Then she crossed one leg over the other, balanced the datapad on her knee, and went back to reading. Nobody else in the room was reading anything. Scarvel of the Vreth delegation had been trained from birth to read rooms. That was what Vreth warlords did. They walked into a space, they catalogued every threat in order of danger, and they placed themselves accordingly. It was not strategy. It was instinct. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in the body before the mind had a chance to form a thought. Scarvel had done it 10,000 times, and in 10,000 rooms, the ranking had always made sense. This room did not make sense. The problem was the small creature in the back row. It was the human. Era, the Earth representative, the one they had been briefed on. Soft body, warm blood, no natural armor, no venom, no echolocation, no chemical defense, minimal size. The briefing had described her species as a mid-range terrestrial omnivore from a Class M world with moderate biodiversity. Nothing alarming, nothing that should have made every hair on Scarvel's ridge stand straight up the moment she walked through the door. And yet, Scarvel turned slowly toward Delegate Poon of the Leth, a prey species with good social instincts. "Tell me," Scarvel said quietly, keeping the vocalization below the room's ambient noise, "what you feel when you look at the human." Poon's secondary eyelids flickered. That was a stress response. "I feel," Poon said carefully, "that I would like to sit on the other side of the room." "Yes," Scarvel said. "Why?" Poonin thought about it. The Leth were honest about their instincts in a way that most species were not. "Because," Poon said, "it is not displaying correctly." That was exactly it. Scarvel had watched Era walk into the room. The walk itself was the first problem, measured, unhurried, completely unbothered. Not the careful tread of prey watching for threats, not the loose, ready movement of a predator on alert. Something else entirely, something in between that did not exist in any taxonomy Scarvel had ever learned. She had walked the way something walks when it has decided, at a very deep level, that the room is not a danger to it. Not because it had assessed the room and found it safe, but because the room had simply not occurred to it as a variable worth tracking. Then there were the eyes. Forward-facing. Both of them. Fixed forward in the skull in the configuration that, across 83 documented species, indicated a predator, a hunter, something that had evolved to track moving targets in front of it, to focus, to pursue. But the eyes were soft, relaxed, slightly unfocused as they moved across the datapad. There was no tension in the muscles around them, no peripheral awareness being suppressed. She genuinely was not watching the room. That was the part that made Scarvel's body want to take 3 large steps backward. A predator that is alert is understandable. A predator that is performing calm as a hunting strategy is understandable. But a predator that is actually, genuinely, chemically calm in a room full of apex species from 40 different worlds, sitting in the back row drinking something hot out of a metal container, was not something Scarvel had a category for. And the hindbrain, when it cannot categorize something, defaults to a single conclusion. Whatever that thing is, it is more dangerous than you. Get away from it. Do not provoke it. Do not draw its attention. Across the room, the call delegation had rearranged itself without any of its members appearing to notice. They had drifted, collectively, in the subtle way that ambush predators drift when they have identified something they are not sure they can take. They were now facing slightly toward Era. Not aggressively, not with posturing, just oriented. The way you orient towards something you have decided to keep in your peripheral vision for the entire duration of whatever comes next. The Shan had noticed this. The Shan noticed everything. They were the largest species in the room by considerable margin, their bodies built like geological events, their chitin plates the color of old iron. They had come to the summit with a specific objective. There was a mineral rights dispute involving 3 star systems, and the Shan position was simple. They would take what they wanted, and the summit would ratify it afterward, and anyone who objected would find the process of objecting more trouble than it was worth. They had done this before. It had worked before. The Shan delegate, whose designation translated roughly as Vethkar of the second plate, watched Era drink her coffee and felt something it had not felt in a very long time. It felt uncertain, not afraid. The Shan did not process fear the way smaller species did, but uncertain, which was, for a Shan, functionally very similar to afraid, because the Shan had not survived 40,000 years of galactic politics by ignoring signals they could not explain. The summit opened formally at the 11th hour, station time. The chief mediator, a Pelin named Su-Reth, whose species had evolved specifically for neutrality, welcomed the delegations, outlined the agenda, and invited opening statements. Era's hand moved on her datapad. She was taking notes. Her coffee was half gone. She had eaten, at some point during the opening remarks, 3 small biscuits from a paper bag she produced from her coat pocket. She had offered one to the Leth delegate beside her. The Leth had stared at the biscuit for a long moment, and then very politely declined. 6 delegates gave opening statements. Era listened to all of them. She did not interrupt. She did not posture. When it was the human delegation's turn, she stood up, gave a clear and direct 2-minute summary of Earth's position on the trade corridor dispute, sat back down and poured more coffee. It was the shortest opening statement of the session. It was also the only one that did not contain a single implied threat. Every predator species in the room had listened to it with the focused attention they usually reserved for sounds they could not identify in the dark. Then Vethkar moved. It happened fast. That was how the Shan operated. Speed was a tool. Shock was a tool. Vethkar crossed the floor in 4 strides and closed one massive arm around the Pelin mediator, lifting Su-Reth completely off the ground with the casual ease of someone picking up a piece of fruit. The room detonated. 340 delegates moved at once, most of them in the direction of the walls and the exits. The instinct of prey species overwhelming diplomatic protocol in an instant. Chairs overturned. The call snapped into their combat configuration, low and wide, backing toward the nearest corner. Scarvel's hand found a weapon it was not supposed to have brought into the summit hall. Poon of the Leth was already under a table. Vethkar's voice filled the room. The demand was not complex. The 3 mineral systems would be ceded to Shan authority. The ratification would happen now. The mediator would be released when the documentation was signed. Anyone who attempted to contact external security would find the process of doing so interrupted in a permanent way. Era set down her coffee. She stood up. She walked toward the noise. The path she took crossed the open center of the hall, past the overturned chairs, past the delegations pressed against the walls, past the call who parted for her without appearing to decide to do so. She walked the same way she had walked in, measured, unhurried. She did not draw anything. She did not call for help. She walked directly to the center of the room, stopped about 4 meters from Vethkar, and looked up at the Shan delegate with the same expression she had used on her datapad. Vethkar looked back. This was the moment that Scarvel would spend many years trying to describe to others. Vethkar was holding a mediator off the ground. Vethkar had the full weight of Shan physical dominance behind it, the accumulated evolutionary legacy of a species that had reached the top of its food chain before it ever left its home planet. And when the human looked up at it, something happened in Vethkar's body that Scarvel recognized because it happened in Scarvel's body too, in the same moment. Watching from across the room, the recognition signal fired. The one that lives below thought, below language, below anything that can be argued with. It said, "This is the wrong thing to have drawn attention from." Era did not say anything for a moment. She just looked. Then she said, in a voice that was completely level, "Put her down." Not a request, not a negotiation opener, not a threat wrapped in diplomatic language. Just a sentence, delivered in the tone of someone who has decided what is going to happen and is giving the other party the courtesy of being informed before it does. Vethkar's secondary respiratory system, which Shan used to process stress hormones, was working very hard. Scarvel could hear it from across the room. Era took 1 step forward. Vethkar took 1 step back. The Shan delegate later told its own command that the human had made a threat display it could not counter, that there had been some signal, some biological output, some weapon it had not been briefed on. Vethkar believed this. It was not a lie. It was just wrong. There had been no display. There had been no weapon. There had only been a biped from a medium-gravity world standing in the center of a room and not being afraid, which was, to the Shan nervous system, indistinguishable from facing something at the top of a hierarchy it had not previously known existed. Era took another step. Su-Reth's feet touched the ground. Vethkar stepped back again, released the mediator fully, and then did something that shocked every delegation in the room. It sat down. not in retreat, not fleeing. It simply, carefully, folded its enormous body into the chair it had been assigned at the start of the session, placed both hands on the table in front of it, and went quiet. Because sitting down was what you did when the thing in front of you had established beyond any reasonable doubt that standing up was not going to work. Ira watched this for a moment. Then she picked up her thermos from the floor, where it had fallen when the chairs went over, checked that it had not spilled, and walked back to the rear bench. She sat down. She poured more coffee. She looked at her datapad. Sureth, the mediator, stood in the center of the room for a long moment, smoothing its robes with hands that were not entirely steady, and then it said, "We will take a 15-minute recess." Nobody moved for those 15 minutes. They all just sat there, looking, mostly, at the back row. Scarvel used the recess to walk to the refreshment area, which happened to be near the rear of the hall, not near Era specifically, just in that general area. While pouring a drink that Scarvel did not want and did not touch, Scarvel looked at the human from a distance of approximately 3 meters. Era was typing something on her datapad. Her coffee was 3/4 gone. Her heartbeat was audible to Scarvel's hearing, slow and steady, the beat of an organism in a state of rest. 3 meters away, Scarvel's heartbeat was doing something considerably more complicated. "Excuse me," Scarvel said. Era looked up. "Yes?" "During the incident," Scarvel said carefully, "you did not appear alarmed." Era thought about this. "It was a hostage situation," she said. "I've read the Shan threat response literature. They back down from what they perceive as dominant challengers. The fastest way to end it was to approach calmly and make direct eye contact. It's a documented de-escalation technique for species with hierarchical combat logic." Scarvel processed this for a moment. "You were not afraid." "I mean," Era said, "it was a bit stressful, but you can't let that show, can you?" She said it the way someone says something that is completely obvious, the way you explain to a child that you hold an umbrella over your head when it rains. Scarvel did not have an answer for this. "Are you all right?" Era asked. She was looking at Scarvel with the forward-facing eyes, both of them, focused and attentive. Scarvel understood, in that moment, that this was what the human thought concern looked like, that it had no idea what it was doing, that the full intensity of its predator gaze, aimed with calm focus at a Vreth warlord who had survived 30 years of interstellar conflict, was being deployed as an expression of polite interest. "I am fine," Scarvel said, and walked away faster than was entirely dignified. The summit reconvened. It ran for another 6 hours. At the end of it, the mineral rights dispute had been resolved through binding arbitration. The Shan had agreed to terms that 2 hours earlier they had called non-negotiable, and 4 separate predator species delegations had filed requests for bilateral meetings with the Earth representative, scheduled for the following week. The Leth, the prey species, filed a report with their homeworld council that night. The report described the human representative as probably fine but should be studied further at a comfortable distance. Scarvel's report to Vreth Command was longer. It covered the biological profile, the behavioral data, the incident, and the de-escalation. It ended with a section on strategic implications that Scarvel had written and rewritten 4 times before settling on language that was accurate without being embarrassing. The core finding was simple. Humanity was not dominant because it was the fastest or the strongest or the most armored. Humanity was dominant because it had evolved on a world where the competition was severe enough that it became, over millions of years, an ambush predator that walks upright, coordinates in groups, communicates in complex language, and has learned to suppress the outward signals of fear so completely that the biological machinery for calm and the biological machinery for focus are, in humans, almost the same thing. They look like predators. They breathe like prey animals at rest. They walk into the center of a conflict and they do not shake. They make eye contact. They wait. They are, every single one of them, the product of an evolutionary line that once hunted large animals to exhaustion across open ground by simply following them. For hours, for days, until the animal had nothing left and the human was still walking. The galaxy had not been ready for that. Era's report to her handler at the Earth Foreign Office was sent at 11:40 that night from her small cabin on the station. It was 412 words. It covered the trade corridor agreement, the bilateral meeting requests, and the incident. The section on the incident was 40 words. It described the situation, the action taken, and the outcome. It did not describe the moment Vethkar stepped back. It did not describe the silence in the room afterward. It did not describe the way every predator species in the hall had looked at her when she walked back to her seat. At the end of the message she typed, "The summit's back on. Everyone wants a bilateral with us first, which I'll need more briefing materials for." Also, the station coffee is acceptable, but bring proper ground stuff when you send the next supply run. And tell command that sitting quietly and not making a fuss turns out to be a surprisingly effective strategy. Who knew? She sent it. She made a note to print the bilateral meeting agenda in the morning. She lay down on the narrow station bunk and fell asleep in under 4 minutes, the way her species always did after a long day. The slow drop into unconsciousness of an organism that is not lying awake listening for things in the dark. In the hall, the cleaning crew worked through the night righting chairs and wiping down tables. One of the workers, a young Leth on his third posting, found a small paper bag under the rear bench. It had 2 biscuits left in it. He stood there holding it for a while, looking at the seat above it, thinking about the shape that had sat there all day, while everything around it happened. Then he set the bag carefully back where he found it, because somehow it felt important not to move anything that belonged to whatever had been sitting in that spot. He was not sure why. It just did. The next morning, Era came back to the hall, found the bag, ate both biscuits with her coffee, and spent 45 minutes preparing for the Vreth bilateral, with the focused, methodical calm of someone who has a full day ahead, and finds that perfectly reasonable. The Vreth delegation arrived for the meeting 7 minutes early. All 4 of them. This had never happened before in Vreth diplomatic history. Scarvel, leading the delegation, paused at the door of the meeting room. Inside, Era was already seated, datapad open, pen in hand, looking up with polite attention, both eyes forward, ready to begin. Scarvel took one breath, then walked in. Because this was the thing that no briefing and no report and no amount of careful preparation had quite managed to communicate. It was not that humanity was frightening. It was that humanity was completely, serenely, utterly comfortable. Comfortable in rooms it did not own. Comfortable at tables where it was the smallest thing present. Comfortable in negotiations where the stakes were enormous, and the other parties were physically imposing, and the whole weight of deep space pressed down on all of them equally. The galaxy had spent 10,000 years building hierarchies of power. It had built them out of size and speed and venom and armor and numbers and firepower. And then a soft, warm, forward-eyed creature from a wet rock of a planet had walked in, sat in the back row, poured itself a hot drink, and turned out to be completely unimpressed by all of it. Not because it was braver, not because it was stronger, but because somewhere deep in its ancient, endurance hunter, persistence-chasing, horizon-watching bones, it had simply never learned to feel small. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. Era clicked her pen and said, "Shall we start?" Scarvel sat down and said, "Yes." And the meeting began. The call bilateral was scheduled for the afternoon. The call were ambush hunters. Their diplomatic style reflected this. They opened negotiations by saying very little and watching. They positioned their delegates at angles that allowed maximum field of vision. They let silence sit in a room for as long as it needed to sit, and they watched what the other party did with it. Most species became uncomfortable. Most species filled the silence, and in filling it, gave away more than they intended. Era sat in the same silence and typed meeting notes. The call delegate, whose name was Iveth Ran, watched this for 3 full minutes. Then Iveth Ran said, "You are documenting." "Taking notes, yes," Era said without looking up. "I find it helps me remember the details accurately. You are not concerned by the quiet." "I like quiet," Era said, and looked up with a small, genuine expression that Iveth Ran's pattern recognition system could not place in any threat or submission category. "It's easier to think." Iveth Ran had been doing this for 19 years. 19 years of reading the biological output of every species at a negotiating table. Heart rate, micro-expression, postural shift, the small involuntary signals that no amount of training ever fully suppressed. Iveth Ran could read a room the way a musician reads a score. Era was a page of blank paper that somehow still meant something. The call bilateral lasted 2 hours and produced a preliminary framework agreement on shipping lane access that was 3 times more favorable to Earth than the projection models had anticipated. Era thanked Iveth Ran, gathered her notes, shook hands in the human way that other species still found either endearing or alarming depending on their relationship with physical contact, and left. Iveth Ran sat alone in the meeting room for a while after she left. Then sent a message to call intelligence that simply read, "Revise all human interaction protocols. Current models are insufficient." Era, 2 corridors away, was looking for somewhere that sold a decent sandwich.